President Biden is rating himself pretty high in dealing with pandemic and other issues, while on the same day, in the evening, Congress defeated the voting right bills. And it was not happy, but Republicans were clapping. This was fifth attempt by Democrats, which was defeated by Republicans. They tried to amend briefly for that movement, the filibuster thing. That did not succeed either because two Democrats joined Republicans in defeating that. How do you rate? And we will be discussing these things with a scholar who is a scholar of associate professor of economics at Denson and president of Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub. Welcome to Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you for having me back on the show.
Thank you so much. So, how do you compare? I mean, people make a big deal about the first 100 days and all that. But when President Biden decided to give a long press conference about his first year, how do you compare it with President Trump's first year?
Well, it's a very interesting question, a very interesting comparison, looking at Trump versus Biden in the first year. If you remember President Biden when he was candidate, Biden during the campaign, he made it very clear that his agenda is to build back better, quote unquote, build back better. And we can assess whether we're building back better or building back the same. And number two, he made it very clear during his campaign that, quote, nothing will fundamentally change. So it's about going back to a pre-Trump system as opposed to structurally and fundamentally changing the US economy and the US system. So what was the pre-Trump system? It was the Obama administration. It was the Clinton and Obama system that the Democrats have established. In terms of the first year of Trump, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It was devastating on so many levels, social, political, and on the economic front. But to assess Biden, he came in during a pandemic with the disastrous situation on the public health front, on the economic front. And his administration managed to bring in the vaccines on a much broader and rapid scale than the Trump administration. But now, a year later, we've stalled. We've stalled in the US in terms of getting higher vaccination rates. We've stalled on the global scale in terms of getting vaccine distribution to every corner of the planet, because we're not going to put an end to this pandemic as long as we leave pockets of the world and pockets within countries where new variants can develop and thrive and automatically spread around the world, like the Omicron variant that we're dealing with right now. So unfortunately, my prediction is that we're going to probably live with this pandemic for at least until the end of the decade, unless something fundamentally different happens on the global distribution of vaccines and really coordination on a global scale. And that's where really the Biden administration hasn't really accomplished much. And because of that, the ripple effect of not putting an end to the pandemic translates into economic and social consequences, by which I mean, as long as we have disruptions caused by the pandemic, we're going to have disruptions to the global economy, to the global supply chain, which means we're going to have inflation pressure points all over the system, globally in the US, that will continue to make certain products more scarce and allow for abusive market power to kick in for key players in the economy to take advantage of the pandemic. And the flip side of it is on the labor side, where workers now are part of what is known as the Great Resignation. Workers are not going to take the existing jobs. Building back better is not happening, in other words, are not going to take existing jobs if wages and benefits and working conditions are just as bad as pre-pandemic and worse with the effects of the pandemic. So I'm not very positive on the economic front, unfortunately.
But President Biden says he has created 6 million jobs, which has never been created ever.
Well, those 6 million jobs was due to the reopening of the economy. So a few of my colleagues and I actually did a recent study, a monthly jobs report, actually green jobs report that we've been doing since the beginning of the pandemic. And we're trying to assess whether the Build Back Better strategy is actually working and how likely is it to work in the future. And what we did is essentially to look at how green versus how extractive the new jobs are in terms of their impact on people, on the planet, and also in terms of financial returns for companies in the private sector. And what we found in the beginning of the pandemic, during the shutdown, is that all industries lost jobs. But what we found is that the greener industries were more resilient, meaning they lost the fewest jobs. And as we reopened the economy in the beginning of the recovery from the pandemic, greener jobs recovered faster than more extractive industries. Greener jobs were also paying better wages than more extractive industries. But as of this last month, for the first time since the pandemic, we found that the more extractive industries are now creating more jobs and recovering faster than the greener industries, are going to exceed the greener industries again, which means we're building back the same, we're not building back better in terms of pay. We're growing the jobs that pay the least in the economy, and we're growing the jobs that are less consistent with decarbonizing and having a positive impact on people on the planet. So we're growing back the same. And that brought me back last week when somebody asked me this question to Biden's quote, where he said, "Nothing will fundamentally change. It's not building back better, it's building back exactly the same as in pre-Trump economic system." And that's just not good enough for all the challenges that we're facing today.
So it seems you're saying that his promise of those two things were contradictory in itself.
Well, promises are promises. It's really actions that matter. So when you look at a strategy to tackle climate change and to decarbonize the system, if you're not tackling the abusive market power of the oil and gas industry, then you're not really serious about it. If you're not tackling climate change by having a coherent strategy that actually decarbonizes some of the most the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases in the US, at least. We're not talking about the globe here. If you're continuing to support investments in oil and gas explorations, then you're not serious. For example, when we had a little bit of a fuss over gasoline prices over the last couple of months, what did the Biden administration say? They immediately called on the oil and gas industry to basically drill more and bring more supply to the market to lower gas prices. That's not building back better. That's building back the same. That's continuing the same thing. I'll give you an example just with some numbers so we know what we're talking about. The biggest oil and gas companies in the world, a lot of them are US, tied to the US at least, if not US based. Last year, collectively invested $500 billion, that's $500 billion, in capital equipment, in capital expenditures. If we're serious about climate change and we know that the life on this planet depends on how quickly we decarbonize, and we're putting in place $500 billion more worth of pipelines and oil rigs and so on, then we're committing all of that investment to extract even more in the next 50 years. So it's one of two things. It's either that the investors who are putting their money on the table for those $500 billion and expect a rate of return over the next several decades, they're being duped because those investments will be shut down eventually as we become more serious about climate change. And that will be the equivalent of fraud. You're defrauding investors of those expected returns. Or we're not actually defrauding investors. We're actually serious about continuing to extract oil and gas for several decades in the future, in which case the $500 billion that were spent on oil and gas extraction infrastructure is the equivalent of a collective suicide pact for the rest of us on the planet. So whichever way you look at it, we're not taking this challenge seriously, and the Biden administration is not doing enough to tackle these structural problems. We're putting 500 billion more, which means we're committing ourselves deeper and deeper into the oil and gas extraction business.
Well, Professor Kaboub, one of the things which he also said, of course, he talked about handling the pandemic, economy and climate change, but also making country more equal. How do you rate him on that? Of course, his own grading is pretty high about what he has achieved.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that we discovered during the pandemic and the pandemic relief funding that was introduced last year, especially support for families with children, support for people who were displaced by the pandemic relief checks, all of those things actually improved people's quality of life during the pandemic. And started to put a dent in childhood poverty, for example. And what did Congress do a year later? We didn't pass the bill that would have extended that kind of support to working families. So when we assess the Biden administration, it's really assessing the whole Democratic Party and their capacity to pass these bills. And unfortunately, it looks like that whole tendency has come to an end now that we have Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema both effectively siding 100% with the Republican Party when it comes to social spending, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to all of these policies that would produce a more equitable system. And then finally, I would say, if the Democratic Party and the Biden administration are actually serious about addressing the issue of structural inequality in the U.S., the child tax credit and all of these bits and pieces of social spending are helpful, but they're not tackling the abusive structural power that we've had in the system for decades. If we're not going after the oligarchy, so to speak, if we're not going after corporate power, if we're not enforcing antitrust laws, if we're not getting rid of corruption from the system, if we're not going after restoring the democratic process by making sure that our elected officials are actually a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not a government of the super PACs, by the super PACs, for the super PACs. And to me, that's not something that the Democratic Party or the Biden administration has been serious about. It's been a lot of rhetoric about small support, relatively small support for working class people, for the poor, and even that looks like is coming to an end. But in terms of going after the powers to be, there's no indication that's been the intention of the Biden administration from the beginning, or that's going to be the case in the next 3 years of his administration.
Well, so you are not much hopeful what he will be doing otherwise than next 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about listening to rhetoric and then following through with action. Anybody can talk about inequality and justice and poverty and climate change. We've heard a lot of talking about this stuff. It's the action that matters. Do you have a coherent strategy to make it happen? And unfortunately, the coherent strategy is not there on the table. And the votes, most importantly, the votes for the right policies doesn't look like the Democratic Party as a whole has enough members who actually agree with these issues to bring them to the table and pass this kind of legislation. And it's been very clear, as you mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, that even on basic democratic equity type of principles, the Democratic Party is not on board with the issues related to the filibuster, with voting rights. It's like we're back to the 1950s again.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kaboub. I wish we can end on a better note, but back to 1950s.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, we have to be realistic about these things. I wish I had positive outlooks to highlight, but the important thing for me in terms of highlighting why things are not working is to really educate, inform, mobilize, and empower people with information. Because this is, if this is truly a democracy and the power is in the hands of the people, then we need to pay attention to what's happening and listen less to rhetorics and focus more on action. And if action is not there, we need to demand better action.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kaboub, for your time. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.